So our next speaker, and you'll help me with your name.
Auréliane Couppey.
Thank you, Auréliane. I'm sorry. I knew I wouldn't have pronounced it better. Auréliane is a PhD student who is working on the victimization process of men who claim to have been abused by their partners or ex-partners and on the masculinist organizations that accompany them. And I think it's a great continuation to the last theme from Chiara's presentation on shame. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I do not have beautiful slides because I wanted to do them. And on the 10th of June, I told myself, I'm going to do the slides. And then I had an idea for my PhD and I started writing. And when I was done writing, it was the 17th and I had to catch my plane. So no slides for you. You're punished. I'm going to start with a quote from Matthew. Matthew is a 43-year-old French banker. He's been tried and convicted for physical and sexual violence. And he considers having been the victim of his ex-wife's abuse, and most notably of his ex-wife's sexual abuse. I met him through Help Battered Men, which is a French association dedicated to helping men who have been abused by their partner or ex-partner. So this is the quote. "It is a kind of sexual violence, being held hostage sexually. By that, I mean that she deprived a couple of sexual relations, especially when before she instituted a very active sex life. It goes from her saying, 'I'd rather sleep with my child than with you in bed,' saying, 'I'd prefer it if you slept on the couch,' for 2, 3, 4 years, to this hostage situation where she says, 'I'm upset, I'm the woman, I have the power, I decide.' Matthew's case, he's saying, is not an unusual one. Out of the 55 men I've interviewed, most of them have been at least accused of violence. About 2/3 acknowledge having used violence in the course of the relationship. About half have been convicted for psychological, verbal, sexual, and/or physical violence. In 2 cases, their partner has been convicted as well. French sociological and psychological literature has long since established that men who use violence in relationships have a tendency to victimize themselves. That is to say that they consider themselves to be the victim of their partner, who they deem to be the real abuser. They identify acts of violence that have been perpetrated against them, and they view their own violence as a response to their partner's doing. There certainly can be a strategic angle to this, as these men have to defend themselves in front of their families, their friends, their colleagues, and in front of the judges. But to view all of this as only a strategy is a mistake. The men I've interviewed do view themselves as victims of domestic violence, and they strive to be recognized as such, as opposed to only be recognized as not guilty. This leads to interrogating these men's perception and definition of violence, their own and their partners. It also leads to denaturalizing violence by considering it the result of a process. The perception of violence contains indeed several factors. First, the event needs to be considered abnormal, unjust, troubling, and/or causing suffering. Then, this particular abnormality needs to be matched with a category, for instance, physical violence, category that has been made available to us by other actors, social movement, feminists, the state, etc. By doing so, an act of violence emerges, and since the void rarely slaps the void, with this act of violence emerge a perpetrator and a victim. This process is also what allows us to attribute both responsibility, innocence, and reparations. This dynamic approach to violence aims to show that violence does not exist outside of social, spatial, and historical structures. It is born, shaped, and expressed within these structures, and, in the context of my work particularly, by contemporary French society and by gender. I will define gender here very briefly as a power dynamic that creates 2 asymmetrical categories, men and women, with men being in a position of power. These categories can only be understood in relation to one another. By studying this process, I aim to gain a better understanding on men who use violence, on men who have suffered from violent acts, and on masculine subjectivation, which I will define later. In order to do this, first, I'm going to analyze how and why things such as a refusal to engage in sexual intercourse, saying "I love you," or slapping and insulting are all considered by the men I've studied to be violent acts. And I'll do that by pointing out that their common denominator is that all of these acts have caused suffering. Then I will show that violence is shaped by sex, or at least what these men consider to be sexual realities, meaning that women and men use different kinds of violence due to their respective biology. The biological argument is also what leads male physical violence to be defined as a biological reaction. Men, being strong, couldn't help themselves but use physical violence, and thus it is defined as something that cannot be blamed. So, I will quote yet another one of my interviewee, Nabil, who is a 32-year-old nurse. Here is one of the major reasons he considers having been abused by his now ex-wife. I quote, "In the morning, I take a coffee. I tell her, you should make me a coffee. I'm sick of making it. You wake up and you don't do anything, so make the coffee." She doesn't do anything, and she tells me, yeah, you can do it on your own. I bought instant chicory because it's faster to make than regular coffee. So I don't even have regular coffee. I make a chicory coffee with hot water. I drink, I go to work. I was sick of it. I was just sick of it. Once, I woke her up, and she says, "Why are you waking me up? I want to sleep." I tell her, "You're waking up, you're making me a coffee, and then you can go back to bed." She's like, No, I don't want to. Get a coffee outside." So I told her I would not let her fall back asleep if she didn't make me a coffee. She started insulting me. She started making me coffee. "Just chicory coffee. We have a coffee machine." But no, she takes a spoonful of chicory with water. She puts that in a microwave, heats it, leaves it. "Here's your coffee," she says, and she goes back to bed. I chose this anecdote first because it always makes some people laugh, so thank you. But also because it shows how heterogeneous the category of violence can be. To Nabil, this is violence, just like his ex-spouse insulting him is violence, just like to other men I've interviewed, slaps are violence, and the refusal to have sex is violence. Now, an analysis could be insult and slaps are a violent act, verbal and physical violence. They match categories of violence which are accepted, widespread, so accepted that they constitute legal categories. The rest does not. But that doesn't explain why Nabil considers the coffee incident to be violent and attributes it a major role in him developing a depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. The answer, and the one thing that unites all the kind of sufferings the men I've interviewed have declared, is that the coffee incident is a great source of suffering for Nabil. He cries as he tells me about it. He explains how it has hurt him a great deal. And because this hurts him, the fact that she refuses to make him a coffee, Nabil considers it violent. He's not alone in this. In fact, very logically, identifying violence by its effect, most notably by its psychological and emotional effect, has historically been successful. The invention of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, has allowed for people to be recognized as victims because their mental state indicated that they had been through abuse, and that this abuse could then be put into light. In contemporary society, one is also often encouraged to identify and solve one's suffering. The popularization of therapy, of online psychological resources, and the mainstreaming of words derived from psychology, such as trauma, healing, narcissist, and others, indicate an acute attention to individual well-being and individual suffering. However, a definition of violence that bases itself only on suffering allows for the negation of power dynamics and the negation of the social nature of suffering. And this is what happens here. Nabil suffers, but his suffering is gendered. It's the fact that his partner does not act as a woman should, by making him coffee, that leads to being hurt. Nabil is indeed perfectly able to make himself a coffee. He's done so when he was single. But now that he's married, a big part of his life and happiness rests on his wife doing her part. When the woman fails at her role and gendered expectations, Nabil suffers. It becomes clear that masculine subjectivation here shapes suffering and therefore violence. By subjectivation, I mean the constitution of the self as such, and all the work that one does on oneself, particularly when faced with the tensions inherent to life, tensions that lead one to having to position oneself and reflects on oneself. Therefore, masculine subjectivation defines the way men both construct and position themselves as men, and the way this shapes and is shaped by everyday and not so everyday experiences. So the situation here presents itself as a woman depriving a man of the things he expects, the things that are normal, that she behaves like a woman married to a man should. The abnormality leads to suffering, which leads to identifying it as violence. It is a reaction to a loss of masculine power, with violence being that privation of power exerted by Nabil's partner. So, I have discussed there how some acts come to be considered violent because they cause suffering. But one should not think that the men I've interviewed all complain about coffee. Some, most of them in fact, quote acts such as slapping, punching, or biting. Now, one might think that these acts are physically violent, right? Yes. Wrong! From my interviewees at least, these acts are psychologically violent. It is not that the men are not able to recognize physical violence. It is that most of them view women as naturally unable to use physical violence and as able to use psychological violence really well. The inability to use physical violence is itself due to two intertwined factors. One, women are physically weaker than men. Two, men, being stronger and more resistant than women, are unable to be hurt by women. Lucas, for example, said that whenever his ex-partner hit him, he, I quote, wouldn't even react. He adds, I'm 1.85 meters, I weigh 100 kilos. She's 1.60 meters, 51 kilos, so... Once, I just pushed her so she wouldn't hit me. She was projected backward. She almost did a 3 meters jump. Lucas was convicted for physical violence. It is because women do not have, for these men, the ability to hurt men physically that even when they act in physical violence, it is not perceived as physical violence. In other words, because women cannot physically hurt men, it means that they are not using physical violence. Once again, the definition of violence as a cause of suffering makes itself known. And once again, the constructed nature of suffering also comes to life. These men describe physical consequences. They bleed, they have bruises, etc. Henceforth, the lack of suffering does not come from either a lack of pain or a lack of strength for the partners, but rather, the men studied do not construct what they experience as suffering because they consider that the use of force from their partner cannot cause physical hurt. And therefore, it doesn't. The tautological nature of this reasoning has its limit, since the men do indeed report the physical acts when asked about the kind of abuse they've been through. They do identify a form of suffering and violence. But as I said before, they consider the acts to be psychologically violent, causing a psychological form of suffering. And that is because they consider women to be very strong psychically. Meaning that women are able to manipulate and control men, just like I'm doing right now. Renaud, a 67 former engineer, tells me, I don't think I'm being sexist by saying this, but the psychological aspect, separating people, isolating them, using their emotion against them, well, it's more your cup of tea than mine. As a man, I'm not really into that kind of logic, manipulating people. The men I've studied don't think that women are unable to be violent, but they do think that women are only capable of certain types of violence, types that suit their pseudo-natural psychological strength. François, the founder of the structure of the organization I've studied, describes a gendered cycle of violence. Male abuser, he says, start by using physical violence before using psychological violence, while for female abusers, they use first psychological violence and only after, sometimes, physical violence. That is, according to him, because of the innate attributes of each gender. Men are stronger physically, women are stronger psychologically, and male victims, thus, are more affected by psychological violence and female victims by physical violence. Here, violence and suffering are defined by biology, or rather, by what these men define as the biological, as a sexual trait, as opposed to a gender trait. Indeed, here, it's not about gender, understood as a power dynamic, but about sex, understood as the naturalization of two different categories, men and women. Sex bodies and sex minds explain the difference in violent behaviors, but also symmetrize them. Psychological violence on men becomes equivalent to physical violence on women. sexing violence erases the weight of gender. But there's more. Indeed, women cannot use physical violence because they're women and because physical violence is a realm of men. But as I've mentioned before, the men I've studied have almost all used physical violence. And this is something they acknowledge. Jewel, a 43-year-old journalist, told me, I hit her until she was on the floor. Jordan, a 46-year-old truck driver, tells me, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I slapped her. I pushed her. Such admissions can seem surprising. Surely people who claim to be victims would frame their violent acts differently. However, as we've seen, physical violence is seen as a man's attribute. This, to the men I've interviewed, means that male abusers use it and female ones don't, but also that all men are able to be violent because their sex gives them physical strength. And that physical strength is equivalent to being able to be physical violence. Strong means and is the same as being physically violent. This equivalence is used as a way to redefine physical violence as a biological trait that exists in men no matter what. They are therefore not responsible for the use of violence, since it is not a choice or something they have a say in using, but rather a natural attribute. This dynamic, defining physical violence as something men are not responsible for, does not stop there and is intimately linked to the definition of female violence as psychological violence. Let's hear again from Jordan. She wanted me to answer violently to her aggressiveness. She succeeded a bit. She wanted me to be mean when she was abusing me. She was hitting me to get me in trouble. I've been convicted 4 times because of this. The victim is convicted, and the one who's causing the blows gets nothing. She was provoking me. She wanted me to become violent, to fuck her up, so that, She wanted people to think I was a mean dad, a violent dad, an alcoholic dad, so she'd get a divorce, keep the house, keep the kid. That was her main goal, end quote. Female violence is psychological, even when it is physical, both because women aren't able to use physical violence, and also because their goal is manipulating the man into becoming physically violent. Women's violence here is the ability to elicit men's physical violence. It is reframed not as violent acts in themselves, but as provocation. Women's violence becomes a way to obtain masculine violence in order to accomplish various nefarious goals, such as having custody of the children during a divorce. These arguments have been studied as manifestation of a masculinist reasoning, but they also show that violence can be defined not only by the act itself, but also by the hurt it causes and by the reason for its uses. If a violent act for someone has a psychological cause behind it, here manipulation, then it can be reclassified as a psychological violence if the cause is seen as more important, more impactful than the act. It also means that men see themselves as even less responsible for the violence than before because they don't cause their own violence. Women do. And so, women become responsible from the violence they suffer from. But this doesn't stop at this particular men's situation, and I'll conclude here. In 2017, France had the Daval scandal. Alexia Daval, a woman, was found dead and partially incinerated. Her husband, Jonathan Daval, had reported her disparition weeks before, organized search parties, given interviews while crying. As it turns out, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, he was a murderer and had tried to cover his crime. 2 years later, Maxence, who's a 50-year-old worker, as we're talking, tells me, Jonathan Daval might have been in the same situation as me, who knows? But he killed her because he didn't have my calm. Maxence is not alone in this. Most men I've interviewed establish kinship with male abusers and male murderers because, as their men and their partner are women, the blame for the violence rests on the women. Thus, just as violence becomes sexed, so does what it means to be a victim of abuse. Men, all men and only men, can be victims, while women always end up being the true abuser, no matter what. And so, almost paradoxically, but not really paradoxically, this redefinition of violence presents itself as a way to reaffirm masculine domination, to legitimate and to legitimize masculine violence as a tool to enforce it. Thank you very much. I have, if you're interested, because I've given a lot of definition, I have a bibliography, mostly in French, but also in English, that I can give to you.